Lady in the Fog wasn't supposed to exist. It was filmed in 6 days, wrapped in borrowed fog machines, and released under 2 different titles because the studio couldn't decide who the audience was. What started as a quick British thriller turned into a transatlantic identity crisis. The director had never worked in England. The star was hired off a cocktail napkin, and one scene, they shot it in an actual funeral home at 2 a.m. because the owner owed someone a favor. These are 20 weird facts about Lady in the Fog, also known as the Scotland Yard Inspector depending on which side of the ocean you bought your ticket, and buried in the madness, a mechanical fog machine that nearly asphyxiated the entire cast. The clock's ticking, the fog's rolling in. Let's solve this mystery. Before a single frame was shot, Lady in the Fog had already been sold to 2 different countries under 2 completely different titles. In Britain, it was marketed as a gothic mystery with atmospheric dread, hence Lady in the Fog, evoking Victorian intrigue in shadowy London streets. But American distributors took one look at the same film and said, nobody's gonna pay to see that. They wanted something harder, more procedural, more masculine. So they renamed it Scotland Yard Inspector, slapped a different poster on it, and sold it as a tough crime thriller. Same movie, same scenes, same actors. But the marketing made it feel like 2 separate films. The British poster featured a woman's face shrouded in mist. The American version showed a stern detective with a magnifying glass. It wasn't just a title change, it was a complete reimagining of what audiences were supposed to expect. And the wildest part? Both versions were released simultaneously in their respective markets. No one told the director. He found out when a friend in New York sent him a magazine ad featuring his film under a name he'd never heard before. In the world of low-budget 1950s cinema, your movie could have an identity crisis before it even hit theaters. Cesar Romero wasn't the first choice to play Detective Inspector Rigby. He wasn't even the second. The role was originally offered to a rising British actor with theatrical chops and a deep voice perfect for film noir. He read the script, loved it, agreed to do it, and then vanished. Not metaphorically, literally vanished. He missed the first table read, then the costume fitting, then the rehearsal. Producers tried calling his agent, his landlord, even his local pub. Nothing. Days before filming was set to begin, they found out he'd spontaneously left England to pursue a stage opportunity in Australia without telling anyone. Panic set in. They needed a name, someone recognizable, someone who could carry a mystery thriller with gravitas. Enter Cesar Romero, a Hollywood actor who'd made a name playing Latin lovers and charismatic rogues, but who desperately wanted to be taken seriously. He was in London visiting friends when his agent called with the offer. No audition, no chemistry read, just, "Can you start Monday?" Romero said yes, flew through the script in one night, and showed up on set ready to play a British detective despite his distinctly American accent. The producers didn't care. They had their star. And Romero, he finally got to play a detective, even if most audiences had no idea it was him under the fedora and trench coat. The fog in Lady in the Fog wasn't atmospheric movie magic. It was a genuine hazard. The production rented 3 industrial fog machines from a local theater company. Machines designed for stage productions with proper ventilation and controlled environments. But this wasn't a theater. It was a cramped London soundstage with poor airflow and no exhaust system. Director Sam Newfield wanted thick, impenetrable fog for the murder scenes, the kind you couldn't see through even if you tried, so they cranked all 3 machines to maximum output and let them run for 20 straight minutes before rolling cameras. What they got wasn't cinematic atmosphere. It was a choking cloud of glycerin vapor so dense that actors couldn't see their marks. Crew members stumbled into equipment, and one cameraman reportedly passed out mid-take from lack of oxygen. The fog didn't dissipate. It hung in the air for hours, seeping into costumes, stinging eyes, coating every surface in a slick residue. Cesar Romero later joked that he spent half the shoot coughing, and the other half pretending to be British. Bernadette O'Farrell, the film's female lead, developed a respiratory infection that lasted 2 weeks. The crew nicknamed the soundstage the gas chamber. And yet, Newfield kept demanding more fog every single time. Because in his mind, if the audience couldn't see clearly, they'd be more terrified. In the end, the fog worked, but at a cost no one expected. The entire film was shot in 6 days. Not 6 weeks, 6 days. That wasn't a creative choice. It was a budget crisis. The producers had secured funding from a small British distributor who'd agreed to finance the picture on one condition. They had to finish before a competing mystery thriller hit theaters and stole their audience. So Newfield devised a brutal shooting schedule. 18-hour days, no breaks, scenes filmed in single takes. And if an actor flubbed a line, they kept rolling. There was no time for reshoots, no room for perfectionism, no luxury of multiple camera angles. What you see on screen is essentially the first draft, captured live with whatever energy the cast could muster at 3 a.m. on day 5. Actors wore the same costumes for days straight because wardrobe couldn't keep up. Lighting setups were recycled. Entire dialogue scenes were blocked and filmed within 30 minutes. Cesar Romero later admitted he never fully memorized the script. He'd read his lines off cue cards hidden behind props, glancing down between sentences, hoping no one noticed. Some crew members fell asleep standing up. The script supervisor stopped taking notes by day 4. And somehow, against every reasonable expectation, they finished on time. The final scene was shot at dawn on the 6th day. The cast collapsed. The crew packed up in silence. And Sam Newfield walked off set knowing he'd just directed one of the fastest feature films in British cinema history. Bernadette O'Farrell had no idea she was playing a femme fatale until she saw the finished film. During production, Newfield directed her to play the character, Heather McMara, as a vulnerable witness caught in a dangerous situation, sympathetic, frightened, someone the audience would root for. O'Farrell prepared accordingly. She studied her lines with innocence, played every scene with wide-eyed sincerity, and built a character who seemed genuinely terrified of the events unfolding around her. But in the editing room, Newfield made a different choice. He recut her performance, emphasizing lingering glances, adding ominous music cues, and rearranging scenes to suggest Heather might be hiding something. Close-ups that felt tender on set now looked suspicious on screen. Her silences, originally meant to convey trauma, suddenly felt calculated. By the time the film premiered, O'Farrell's innocent witness had become the prime suspect, and she had no idea. Friends who saw the film came up to her afterward, commenting on how brilliantly she had played the ambiguity, the moral complexity, dangerous allure. She smiled and thanked them, but privately she was furious. Newfield had rewritten her entire performance in post-production without telling her. She later said it taught her a hard lesson about filmmaking. You can give one performance on set, and the editor can create another in the cutting room, and there's nothing you can do about it. The film's iconic opening sequence, where a body is discovered in the fog-drenched streets of London, wasn't filmed in London at all. It was shot in a back alley behind a Shepperton Studios warehouse at 2 in the morning, because that was the only time the location was available. The crew worked by flashlight, laying down wet cobblestones they'd borrowed from a nearby construction site, rigging portable fog machines, and praying no one would notice the modern street signs visible just outside the frame. The body in the scene wasn't a dummy. It was a stunt performer named Eddie Powell, who would later become famous for doubling Christopher Lee in Hammer horror films. Powell lay face down on cold, wet pavement for 40 minutes straight while they lit the scene, tested the fog density, and argued about camera angles. No padding, no blanket, just concrete and patience. By the time they finally rolled cameras, Powell was shivering so badly his body was visibly shaking in the shot. Newfield loved it. He thought it added realism, made the corpse look freshly dead, still settling into rigor mortis. So they kept it. What audiences see in that opening isn't acting. It's a man genuinely suffering from hypothermia while pretending to be a murder victim. And when the scene wrapped, Powell stood up, dusted himself off, collected his 20-pound paycheck, and walked straight to the nearest pub to warm up. No complaints, no drama. Just another night's work in 1950s British cinema. Cesar Romero refused to speak with a British accent, and the producers had no choice but to let him. During the first day of rehearsals, Romero attempted a clipped, upper-class London accent he'd learned from a dialect coach. It lasted exactly 3 lines before Newfield stopped him. The accent was terrible. Not charmingly bad, just bad. Stiff, inconsistent, distracting. Romero knew it. The crew knew it. Everyone knew it. But rather than delay production, Newfield made a snap decision. They'd rewrite the character. Detective Inspector Rigby would now be an American investigator on loan to Scotland Yard, consulting on a case involving transatlantic criminal connections. It didn't make perfect sense within the plot, but it made enough sense to justify Romero's natural California accent. The screenwriter was pulled aside and told to insert a single line of expository dialogue explaining Rigby's background. One actress, in a hastily rewritten scene, now asks Romero, "You're not from around here, are you, Inspector?" And Romero replies, "New York, originally. Transferred over last year." That was it. 15 seconds of dialogue, and suddenly the entire film's logic shifted to accommodate one actor's inability to sound British. The wildest part? American audiences never questioned it. They assumed it was always part of the story. But British viewers, they noticed, and critics in London specifically called out the bizarre decision to make Scotland Yard's lead detective an American. Romero later admitted he was embarrassed by the whole situation, but not embarrassed enough to learn a proper accent.
It's getting pretty thick. I get out and walk on ahead.
The funeral parlor scene, where Inspector Rigby questions a mortician surrounded by coffins and flickering candles, was filmed inside a real funeral home. Not a set designed to look like one. An actual operational funeral parlor in central London that conducted services during the day and rented out its space at night to low-budget film productions. The owner, a man named Thomas Whitmore, had a side hustle financing his business by letting filmmakers use his parlor after hours. But there was one rule: don't move the coffins. Some of them were occupied, awaiting burial services scheduled for the following morning. The crew arrived at midnight, set up lights around the room, and blocked the scene carefully to avoid disturbing anything. But during the second take, a crew member accidentally knocked over a candelabra. It crashed into an open coffin display, nearly tipping it over. Everyone froze. Romero, midline, stopped talking and stared. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Whitmore, who'd been watching from the doorway, calmly walked over, righted the candelabra, brushed off the coffin, and said, "Carry on." They finished the scene in tense silence, acutely aware they were performing next to the dead. Romero later said it was the most unsettling shoot of his career, not because of the fog, not because of the rush schedule, but because he kept wondering if the coffins around him were empty. He never asked. He didn't want to know. And Newfield, he loved every second of it, because that underlying dread, that genuine discomfort, it bled into the scene, and audiences felt it. The film's score wasn't composed specifically for Lady in the Fog. It was recycled from 3 different movies. Low-budget productions in the 1950s rarely had the money to hire composers for original scores, so they'd pull music from a studio's library of pre-existing recordings, mixing and matching until something fit. For Lady in the Fog, the music supervisor assembled a Frankenstein soundtrack using cues from a 1948 war film, a 1950 Western, and a 1949 swashbuckler. Dramatic strings from a battlefield scene now underscored a tense interrogation. Romantic violins from a cavalry charge played over a foggy London street. Swashbuckling horns accompanied a rooftop chase. None of it was meant to work together, and technically, it didn't. The shifts in tone were jarring. Musical motifs started and stopped abruptly. Some scenes had wall-to-wall music, while others played in silence simply because they couldn't find a cue that fit. Critics noticed. One review specifically called the score bizarrely inconsistent, as if someone had shuffled 3 different soundtracks together. But audiences didn't care. Most viewers in 1952 weren't analyzing the orchestration. They were watching the mystery unfold. And by the time the credits rolled, nobody remembered the music anyway. It was background noise, functional but forgettable. Decades later, film historians would analyze Lady in the Fog and identify the exact films each musical cue came from. But at the time, it was just another cost-cutting measure in a production held together by compromises. Newfield later joked that the film's greatest magic trick was convincing people it had a real score at all. The film's final twist, where the killer's identity is revealed in a dimly lit warehouse confrontation, was rewritten on set during the actual shoot. The original script had a different culprit, a different motive, and a different ending. But midway through production, the producers decided the reveal wasn't shocking enough. So Newfield gathered the key cast members during a lunch break, explained the new ending, and asked if anyone had objections. Romero shrugged. O'Farrell, still unclear about her character's motivations, just nodded. The supporting actor, who was now suddenly the killer, looked stunned, but said nothing. There was no time to rehearse. They filmed the rewritten climax that same afternoon, with actors delivering lines they had learned minutes earlier, blocking movements on the fly, improvising reactions because nobody knew how to play a scene that hadn't existed that morning. The result is chaotic in the best way. Characters speak over each other, pauses feel uncertain. The tension is raw because it's real. Nobody on screen is entirely sure what's happening, and that confusion translates into genuine suspense. Audiences watching the film have no idea the ending was written just hours before it was shot, but you can feel it. There's an urgency, an instability, a sense that anything could go wrong at any moment. Because behind the scenes, everything was going wrong, and somehow that made the scene work better than any carefully planned climax ever could have. The poster was painted before anyone had seen the finished film. In 1952, marketing materials were often created based solely on script descriptions and production stills. A freelance artist was hired to create the key art for both the British and American releases. He was given a 3-sentence plot summary and a single photograph of Cesar Romero in costume. That's it. No footage, no context, no creative input from the director. He spent 2 days painting a dramatic scene of a woman screaming in fog while a shadowy figure loomed behind her. Beautiful work. Genuinely atmospheric. Only problem. That scene doesn't exist in the movie. Nowhere in Lady in the Fog does anyone scream in the fog with a looming figure behind them. The closest moment is a brief shot of O'Farrell looking worried in a hallway. No fog, no shadow. But the poster looked good, so they used it. Audiences bought tickets expecting a specific kind of thriller, and what they got was something completely different. Some felt cheated, others didn't notice. The artist never saw the film. He got paid, moved on to the next job, and never knew his painting had absolutely nothing to do with the story it was selling. There are 13 visible continuity errors in the final cut, and Sam Newfield knew about every single one. During the rapid 6-day shoot, mistakes piled up. Romero's tie changes pattern between shots in the same scene. O'Farrell's hair is pinned up in one angle, down in the reverse shot. A clock on the wall shows 3:15, then 2:40, then 3:15 again within the same conversation. In one sequence, a character enters through a door marked private, but when they exit seconds later, the door now says storage. Newfield spotted them during editing. His assistant compiled a list, expecting they'd fix at least the obvious ones. But Newfield refused. Not because he didn't care, but because fixing them would cost money and time they didn't have. Every correction meant reassembling scenes, potentially reshooting, definitely delaying the release date, and the distributor had made it clear. The film had to be in theaters by March or the deal was off. So Newfield made a calculated bet. He gambled that audiences in 1952 wouldn't notice, or if they did, wouldn't care enough to demand refunds. He was right. Contemporary reviews never mentioned continuity errors. Audiences were too caught up in the mystery to spot the mistakes. It wasn't until decades later, when film students began studying Lady in the Fog, that anyone bothered counting. The Scotland Yard technical advisor quit on day 2. The producers, wanting authenticity, hired a recently retired detective inspector to consult on police procedures, dialogue, and protocol. He showed up excited, ready to ensure the film accurately portrayed Scotland Yard operations. Then he read the full script. The interrogation techniques were wrong. The chain of evidence made no sense. Detectives spoke in ways no real officer would. When he tried explaining this to Newfield, the director listened politely, nodded, and then ignored every suggestion. The advisor watched them film a scene where Romero's character barges into a suspect's home without a warrant, without backup, and without following any recognizable police procedure. He approached Newfield again, more insistent this time. Newfield's response: "We're making entertainment, not a training film." The advisor packed his briefcase and left, never came back, never collected his remaining payment. Years later, when asked about the experience, he said, "I thought I was consulting on a police procedural, Turns out I was watching a fever dream where laws don't exist and detectives solve crimes through sheer stubbornness and luck. He wasn't wrong, but that's exactly what made Lady in the Fog entertaining. Reality would have been boring. The fever dream kept audiences guessing. Cesar Romero brought his own wardrobe because the costume department's budget had been gutted at the last minute. When Romero arrived for his fitting, he discovered they had allocated money for exactly 2 costumes, 1 trench coat and 1 suit. That was it. For a 6-day shoot with multiple locations and story days spanning a week of investigative work, his character would wear the same outfit in every single scene. Romero, a Hollywood veteran who understood how limited wardrobe could hurt a performance, offered a solution. He happened to be traveling with 3 of his own suits, 2 overcoats, and several ties. He told the producers they could use whatever they needed. No rental fee, no contract, just a professional doing what needed to be done. The costume department gratefully accepted, and suddenly Detective Inspector Rigby had a wardrobe that suggested a real person who changed clothes. In several scenes, you can spot Romero wearing his personal clothing, pieces he'd worn to premieres and parties. That gray flannel suit in the interrogation scene, he wore it to a Hollywood gala 2 months earlier. The fedora he tips to a witness. His own hat, purchased in New York in 1947. By lending his wardrobe, Romero saved the production money and gave his character a lived-in authenticity the budget couldn't afford. And he never asked for reimbursement, just another day's work. The film premiered simultaneously in London and New York on March 15, 1952, but neither version was complete. The British print ran 72 minutes. The American print ran 68 minutes. They weren't different cuts. They were the same film, with random sections missing due to shipping damage and lab errors. The British version was missing an entire scene where Rigby examines evidence at headquarters. American audiences never saw a crucial conversation between 2 suspects that explained their connection. Neither cut was the director's intended vision. They were just what survived the rush to meet the release date. Newfield found out about the missing scenes 2 days after the premiere when a friend in New York called to say the plot didn't make sense. Newfield asked what he meant. The friend described scenes he'd never seen. Newfield realized different markets were watching different versions of his film, and nobody had told him. He tried to fix it, demanded the distributor recall the prints and issue complete versions. They refused. The film was already in theaters, already making money. Close enough. To this day, film archivists debate which version is more complete. But the truth is, nobody's ever seen the full Lady in the Fog, not even the director. Hey, pretty wild so far, right? If you're enjoying this investigation into one of cinema's strangest productions, go ahead and like or subscribe, because coming up, we've got an actor who forgot he was in the movie, a premiere where nobody showed up, and the mystery of why this film has 2 completely different endings depending on where you watched it. Trust me, it gets even stranger from here. Jeffrey Keane, playing a supporting role as a suspicious art dealer, forgot he'd appeared in Lady in the Fog. Decades later, in a 1980s interview about his career, a journalist asked about his early work and specifically mentioned Scotland Yard Inspector. Keane looked confused. The journalist clarified, Lady in the Fog, the 1952 thriller. Keane insisted he'd never been in such a film. The journalist showed him a photograph. Keane studied it, squinted, and finally said, "Good Lord, that is me, isn't it?" He genuinely had no memory of it. Not the shoot, not the director, not Cesar Romero, nothing. When pressed, he vaguely recalled a very quick job in early '52, maybe 2 days of work, mostly standing around in fog. But the title, the plot, his character's name, all gone. This wasn't dementia or old age. Keane's memory of other films from that era was crystal clear. Lady in the Fog had simply been so rushed, so unremarkable during production, so minor in his early career, that it never registered. He'd shown up, delivered his lines, collected a paycheck, and moved on. The film meant nothing to him. It was just another job in a year full of forgotten jobs. And somehow, that's the perfect encapsulation of what Lady in the Fog was. A movie so hastily made that even people in it couldn't remember being there. The film's UK premiere at a small Leicester Square cinema was attended by exactly 11 people. Not 1,100, 11. The distributor had scheduled it for a Wednesday afternoon in March, the worst possible time slot, with minimal advertising and no star appearances. Cesar Romero was back in Hollywood. Bernadette O'Farrell wasn't invited. Sam Newfield wasn't even informed there was a premiere. The screening was purely a contractual obligation, something to tell investors and legal teams. The 11 attendees included 3 film critics who had been sent by their editors, 2 elderly couples who'd come in from the rain and bought tickets to anything, and 4 teenagers who'd hoped to see a different movie but walked into the wrong theater. None of them stayed for the entire film. By the halfway mark, it was down to 6 people. By the climax, just 3. When the lights came up, the theater was empty except for the projectionist. No applause, no discussion, no reaction whatsoever. One critic's review the next day called it a perfectly competent thriller that will be forgotten by Friday. He was right. The American premiere in New York went slightly better, with about 40 attendees, mostly because it was a double bill with a Western that people actually wanted to see. Lady in the Fog was the appetizer nobody ordered, and somehow, that quiet, ignored premiere perfectly captured the film's fate. Number 18. There are 2 different endings, and nobody knows why. The British version ends with Inspector Rigby arresting the killer on a rooftop at dawn, delivering a somber line about justice, and walking away into the fog as dramatic music swells. Clean, conclusive, slightly melancholy. The American version ends with Rigby and Heather sharing a brief, awkward conversation in his office, where she thanks him and he tips his hat. Then a hard cut to credits. No rooftop, no fog, no dramatic music. Completely different tone. For years, historians assumed the American distributors cut the ending for time. But in 2003, a researcher found production documents showing both endings were filmed. Newfield shot 2 versions during that chaotic 6-day schedule, one for each market based on distributor demands. The British distributor wanted atmospheric tragedy. The American distributor wanted romantic closure. Newfield, exhausted and out of time, just shot both. Neither ending was his preferred choice. In private notes discovered after his death, Newfield wrote that the real ending should have been darker, more ambiguous, less satisfying. But he never got to make that version. Instead, the film exists in 2 forms, each incomplete in different ways, each compromised by commercial demands. And audiences, depending on where they lived, walked away with completely different impressions of the same story. The film was banned in Ireland, and nobody could figure out why. The Irish Film Censor's Office rejected Lady in the Fog for public exhibition without explanation. No specific scenes cited, no moral objections listed, just a stamp, rejected. The distributors appealed, offering to cut anything deemed offensive. The censor's response? The entire film was unsuitable. Desperate, they asked what specifically needed to be removed. Silence. The ban stood for 3 years before being quietly lifted in 1955, again with no explanation. Historians later speculated the censor objected to the film's moral ambiguity, its sympathetic portrayal of morally gray characters, or perhaps just its general atmosphere of corruption and decay. But officially, nobody knows. The Irish ban became a bizarre footnote, giving Lady in the Fog a tiny bit of forbidden fruit appeal in neighboring UK markets. Some British viewers crossed the Irish Sea specifically to see what the fuss was about. They came back disappointed. There was nothing scandalous, nothing banned-worthy. Just a middling thriller that happened to offend one censor's sensibilities for reasons he took to his grave. The ban did more for the film's reputation than its quality ever could. Mystery solved, except for the one mystery that mattered. Sam Newfield directed Lady in the Fog under a pseudonym, Sherman Scott, because he'd already released 2 other films that same year and didn't want his name appearing 3 times in the trades. Hollywood had an unspoken rule. Directors who worked too much were considered hacks. Quality directors took their time, carefully selected projects. Newfield was neither careful nor selective. He worked constantly, churning out B-movies and programmers at an inhuman pace. In 1952 alone, he'd direct 5 feature films under various names. Lady in the Fog was his fastest, his cheapest, and his most forgotten. He never spoke about it in interviews. When asked about his 1952 output, he'd mention the others and skip right over Scotland Yard Inspector. It wasn't shame exactly, more like indifference. To Newfield, it was just another job, another paycheck, another week of his life converted into 72 minutes of celluloid. But decades later, when critics began re-evaluating his work, they found something interesting. Lady in the Fog wasn't his worst film. It wasn't his best, but it was perhaps his most honest. Stripped of budget, time, and pretension, it was just pure filmmaking. Point the camera, capture the performance, move on, no flourishes, no excess, nothing wasted. And in that economy of means, there's a strange kind of integrity. Newfield died in 1964, still using pseudonyms, still working constantly. Lady in the Fog was barely mentioned in his obituary, but it survived. In 1988, a 16mm print of Lady in the Fog was discovered in a barn in Wales, wrapped in newspaper from 1953 and stored in a wooden crate marked "worthless stock." A farmer had bought the crate at an auction decades earlier, never opened it, and used it as a step stool for 35 years. When his grandson finally pried it open out of curiosity, he found the film canister inside, perfectly preserved by accident. The print was donated to the British Film Institute, where archivists confirmed it was the most complete version of the British cut ever recovered, including scenes missing from all other known prints. That barn in Wales, through sheer neglect and luck, had preserved a piece of cinema history that studios and archives had failed to maintain. The farmer's grandson asked if the film was valuable. The archivist smiled and said, "Not really, but it exists."